Purutia te tauru o te rangi kia tīna, kia wena, kia toko te Whānau Ora. Tīna toko te Whānau Ora ki hea, tīna toko te Whānau Ora. Ki rangi nui e tui honei kia papa tuanuku e takoto nei. Ki tēnā tātou te wānau, ngā whanaunga me ngā piringa karanga maa. Apati atu ki te hunga māwiwi, te hunga e tāmi ana i te pōritanga. Koia rā e rongo, whakeiri ake ki runga kia tīna, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. A e te whānau, tēnā rā koutou o koutou awa o koutou maunga, ki runga i tēnei kaupapa o tātou, ara he Waka Eke Noa. He kaupapa rangahau, he kaupapa whakaara, he kaupapa kia whai rongoa tātou te iwi Māori, mo i nei kaupapa e pāna ki te taukinotanga o te tangata, o te ngākau, o te Māori, me te whakaara, me te whakaora anō o tātou te iwi Māori. It is a pleasure to be here with you, e Ma, to be with you to support this kaupapa being presented by Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki and its whānau whānui, ngā māreikura, ngā kairangahau, e hora ngā kōrero, e hara no rātou anake, engari no te ao, ngā kai kōrero. Our researchers are presenting research in this series of webinars, not only their own kōrero, but the voice of those who shared their insights into this rangahau about violence and about whānau responses to violence, and also so many kaupapa. Our session today is about tikanga, tauranga and healing practices. We're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Leonie Pihama sharing with us today. Before we invite Leonie to share her kōrero, just a few notes. We are in a webinar environment and you can't see other people within this environment, but what you can do is you can ask questions using the pop-up box down the bottom of your screen. It's a Q&A. Down in the middle, you'll see the letters Q&A. Click on there and you can write your question, and that will be shared with us in the team, in the presentation team today. You can unclick that button so that we can see Ngā Wai Te Pātai, should you wish. And we can just note that there have been a significant number of whānau who have joined us so far in these sessions. Aho kua kare tae te kite te tangata, me rongo te wairua o te hunga, e hui mai ana, e whakarongo mai ana ki e nei kōrero whakahira. We want to acknowledge the rōpū who have supported Tūtama Wahine, and particularly led by Leonie Pihama in this research. So we just mihi tū te tupu ara, te ara tupu, pūranga kura, te wānanga, whare wānanga o awanui ārai, te puna oranga, te atawhai o te ao, Māori and Indigenous Analysis Limited, Kākāriki Consulting Limited, te Rau Aroha Lalanga Training and Consultancy, and this mahi has been funded through the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Ko tēnei, ko hene rangi Edwards tēnei. I'm a kai rangahau myself from the whānau of Aotea, who are supporting this mahi. Whānau, we're bringing out a lot of kōrero in this webinar series. We want to just invite you to look after yourselves, to listen, to enjoy the rongoa that comes through these sessions, but also to consider your own personal needs. So many of you have your own connections and support structures to support you to wānanga any mamai that you're carrying right now, but here are 3 entities also to support you. So Māori Oho provides resources and support from a Ao Māori perspective, so www.maorioho.org.nz. The Family Violence Info Line, 0800, phone 0800 456 450, and also a website, Are You OK? www.areyook.org.nz. They're just some of the resources that are available to you, but also, you know, mā te wai, ka ora. So find wai, go to find some wai where you are maybe, or just have a sip of wai, and kei konei mātou. Also e te whānau, if you would like to use another tool on Zoom that helps you to hear and read the kōrero from myself or our presenter today, we have shared a link in the chat, so please feel free to use that. Our presenters are also going to share their slides with you via email. So should you find that the slides are, you want to just digest and think about those messages a little bit more, you will have them via your email. We ask that you think about how you share the materials that are presented and how you attribute those. And what that means is, mehe mea e hara nō ngā kōrero, me tuku mihi ki te puna kua utaina mai ngā kōrero. So when we talk about attribution, we're saying, please acknowledge the puna or the source from which you receive this kōrero and share it with others. Kia te anō rā e te whānau. Konui e rā pānoi o te rā pia. Maybe it's time that we welcome our mare kura for this session, and that is Dr. Leonie Pihama. So he tuakana tēnei ki au, taku wai Māori e, nō roto i a taranaki maunga, nō roto anō hoki i a tainui waka. Leonie, he nui o pukinga, he nui o pōtai, and you are a director of Māori and Indigenous Analysis Limited, and which is a Kaupapa Māori consultancy, and you're also working, research company, I should say, and also a co-principal investigator with Dr. Linda Smith on he Waka Eke Noa, and with so many other pōtai as well. E te rangatira, e te tuakana nau mai hara mai ki Wainganui i a mātou nei, ngā kai wakarongo. And can I just, before I jump off the screen, Leonie, how does it feel when research that you have worked years on starts to get shared with whānau, and like this forum, a webinar is quite a different way of sharing research. How are you feeling about it?
Kia ora tātou. Tēnā koutou I huhu mai nei tēnei ahi. He pātai pai tēnā. You know, this is really a part of a wider process of sharing the whakaaro. I mean, you know, for Kaupapa Māori research, we don't do it for research's sake. You know, the work that we do comes out of our whānau hapu iwi, out of our organisations, out of our hapori, out of a need, you know, that our people articulate or express. And so, you know, a key part of it is making sure that that information is shared as widely as we possibly can, which is why we've chosen to do this particular webinar series as another part. It's part of a bigger parcel, a bigger program of work that we've been doing. And, you know, we know that it's ongoing. You don't ever finish a project like this. We just continue the conversations, continue the discussions, continue the work. And from He Waka Eke Noa, you know, a couple of other pieces of work have already grown. And so anyone who's involved in the Kaupapa Māori rangahau that's about transformative ways of being, what we often find is that in the midst of the mahi, something else comes up. Something else comes that our people want to know more about. And in fact, the Waka Eke Noa came from a previous piece of work we did, He Ora Ngākau, around trauma-informed care. And it came from a couple of questions from the providers that we were working with and that we continue to work with, Tūtuma Wahine o Taranaki and Te Puna Oranga I o Tautahi, around wanting to do more investigation around the place of tikanga and healing and this notion of collective responsibility. How do we bring the collective back into shifting and changing the context that we find ourselves in, both in terms of interpersonal violence and in terms of community imposed and state violence? How do we come back together as collectives of people who are doing work often in a whole range of institutions or places and spaces? And so the question came, and the discussion grew from that mahi to now do this mahi. And as I said, other work has now grown out of that. And I did want to mention at some point in this, so I'll do it now. Another area of work that we were asked to do more in-depth work into is around kariaroto. And so we've just begun a piece of work with Jenny Lee Morgan and Rangi Mātāmua around kariaroto. What does kariaroto mean for Māori? What are our emotional expressions and understandings? How do we do those through, whether it be through maramataka, whether it be through pūrākau, whether it be through ceremony, maybe they're associated with things like matariki. So the work itself just continues to grow as we share more. So it's actually, yeah, it's our role and obligation to share the work, and it's our honour. So. Kia ora hene rangi, mo te rā pātai. This session is following up from, for those of you who were a part of the session prior, where he was talking about tikanga concepts and practices that Whānau had raised and talked about specifically. There are a whole lot of other tikanga that people talked about, but what we have tried to do is bring forward the ones that were most raised and most discussed in the work. But alongside that, people shared their whakaaro, their experiences, their practices in terms of tikanga and mātauranga and how that relates to, I guess, really sources of mātauranga, sources of where knowledge can come from, and how those systems of knowledge can support us in terms of healing. So I wanted to talk specifically in this kaupapa around tikanga and mātauranga sources of healing and healing practices that come from that. So in the very first day of discussion, when we talked about definitions of violence, one of the things we talked about is the epistemic violence, or the violence of knowledge production, the violence of ways in which knowledge, the colonial imposition, the colonial oppression of te reo, of tikanga, of mātauranga is a form of epistemic and intellectual violence that removes knowledge and practices from our everyday experiences. So we really start in this space around looking at revisiting, I guess, what Lihi had talked about, that tikanga throughout the mahi was 100% from all of those engaged, that tikanga is central. Tikanga is central to both the prevention and intervention of whānau knowledge. And one of the kaikoro, and I've pulled it out here, said what we're saying is that violence occurs in the absence of tikanga, then naturally the way to restore all of that, or to prevent, is to put back in place tikanga. Or they talk about corrected tikanga, but really is about putting in place tikanga, what is correct from our perspective as Māori. And that tikanga comes from places and sources like atua, like pūrākau. There was a question around atua from Sienna in the earlier session that I want to touch on a little bit when we get to that section. But that there are these knowledge forms that people are saying we have to really strongly reconnect to and bring back into our daily living, our everyday experiences, and to share those with those who don't have access to those knowledges. So when we're talking about Mātauranga Māori, we're often talking about it really as Māori knowledge or Māori knowledges, philosophies of knowledge, Māori ways of knowing and being. Okay? And this is directly from some writing that Linda did within the report and within a discussion of mātauranga, and she talks about mātauranga as being the system of knowledge, the knowledge of everything, the organising principle for making sense of what we do, including the methodologies of everything that we might seek. So mātauranga provides us with these ideas that embrace a whole range of knowledges. There is not a singular one. We know through whānau hapu and iwi, we have a range of tikanga, we have a range of kawa. Often the knuckle or the essence of that remains the same, but we have different ways of actually expressing and practicing that. And that's actually okay. It's okay to have multiple ways of understanding how we do things within our hapu and iwi. And that one of the things that's come up through the mahi is people talking about, just in more general terms, I know that Ngaupi has spoken about this quite a lot. You know, it's okay for us as Māori to localize the way in which we approach things, because we do that anyway. We do that through the ways that we express our own kawa and our own tikanga as whānau hapu and iwi. So I don't want to do this kind of blanket idea that this is the only mātauranga that we have. We're just talking about some of the things that people talked about in this particular project, but there are many, many other ideas. So one of the other things that was written into the whakaaro around the port is that if we think about Mātauranga Māori as a systems of knowledge that embrace multiple forms of knowledge or disciplines or ways of being or ways of knowing, our values, our practices, our principles for living, our learning, our knowing. It includes a whole range of ideas about our creation, ideas about how we are, the ideas of our being, the nature of how we live, the nature of how we live in relationship with environment, with concepts of time, concepts of space, our relationships to the whenua, to the ao. It encompasses how we think about our emotions, how we think about thinking, how we organise ourselves, how we transport ourselves, how we voyage across spaces, down to our daily experiences of how we garden, how we weave, what our house is like, all of those things. And it also informs us around social order. What is social order? How we think about social order. And that's something that Moana J wrote about a lot in terms of tikanga. We did not require a police force pre-colonisation because we had our own mechanisms of social order that actually were collectively based and where people had collective accountability, responsibility and obligations to each other. So in terms of tikanga and mātauranga providing us not only with understandings of social order, it also gave us and gives us still understandings of what we might do when there are breaches or transgressions of that social order. And on top of that, how we might resolve that to return to a sense of balance. So there he talked about Māori in the earlier session. And she gave acknowledgement to the work of Taina Pohatu in that space around Māori. And what Taina says in his work, and he has said consistently, as have many others across our whānau hapu and iwi, is that Māori, to return to Māori tau is to return, and Māori Ora is to return to a sense of balance. So in order to move into a sense of balance, we have to know first and foremost, what is the imbalance that is happening? What is the imbalance in our lives in order to move into a space or return to a space of Māori tau or Māori Ora? Mātauranga has multiple expressions, and that's what we want to talk a little bit about today. The way in which people source Mātauranga Māori, the way in which our people share mātauranga Māori. Linda touched on whakapapa in her first session, and so I don't want to go into that in a lot of depth, but it is a critical way in which returning to whakapapa and whakapapa kōrero brings us back into a space of knowing mātauranga. So as Hirangi said, we're going to send these slides out as we did last week. So these are really just to give you examples, and I know they're very wordy, and in that sense, you can blame the academic in us for wordifying it in such a way. But we did want to make sure that when we share these slides that you get a whole range of words from the project itself and not just from us. So when we're thinking about these experiences of whakapapa, and this is from Ranginui Walker, that it's within those spaces and places that we're able to think about our connections, to think about our whanaungatanga, to think about how we relate to our environment and to our place. And Ane Makai there talks about whakapapa, as being really imperative. So we know that it is an imperative to our relationship to our tupuna and our relationship to our mokopuna. We've said in other mahi that we've done, drawing on the work of Karina Walters and Michelle Johnson-Jennings in particular around their Trail of Tears work with Choctaw communities, that we are simultaneously ancestor and descendant. We are simultaneously grandparent and grandchild. We are simultaneously mokopuna and tupuna. So thinking about whakapapa as a critical site through which we understand and which we can access knowledge is really important. One of the things that I know that I've experienced in my own self in the past year is that in returning to live in Waitara and re-engaging in a more daily way with taranaki, with Te Atiawa, with reconnecting in a daily way. Because I've never felt that I've been disconnected from who I am, but there is something that is I've seen happening in terms of myself and my own tamariki and mokopuna, with having the daily presence and being able to hear more daily the whakapapa kōrero. So it's like in the mahi, people are saying, how do we provide that? How do we find ways of practicing that so that we can reconnect to that kōrero that comes from our whakapapa lines, which is fundamentally not only about our connections, but about our histories. It's about our histories. And in the Waka Eke Noa, the He Oranga Ngākau project, one of the things that came up very clearly was we need to know our backstories. We need to know where this mamai derives. We need to know where it comes from, but we also need to know where the joy is. We also need to know the stories of our connection. And so, as Linda said in the first series, in her first presentation, whakapapa is a critical, and as Ani has said, it's a critical component to who we are and how we come to know the sources of knowledge that are associated with our whānau hapu and iwi and with our connections. So there are a number of things that I want to speak to from, and I can't cover all of them in this particular process, but in this session, I want to talk to a number of sources of mātauranga Māori, or the way in which our people access mātauranga Māori. So there are a number of things that people raised consistently: pūrākau, atua, whakatauki, whakatauaki, maramataka, rongoa, karakia, kapahaka, waiata mō tiatia, whakapakari tinana, and a number of subgroupings that come under that. So I want to begin with pūrākau. And pūrākau, as we know, is our fundamental way of understanding Māori narratives. And if you have the opportunity to read Jenny Lee's work around, Jenny Lee Morgan's work around pūrākau, she talks about pūrākau as giving us a structure and a system of intergenerational knowledge transmission that operates along other alongside other Mātauranga Māori forms, and that storytelling and a return to storytelling is critical to our understanding of our world and our relationships. And other Indigenous scholars like Joanne Archibald, Jason DeSantolo, and others have also talked about the role of narratives, Indigenous narratives and storytelling forms as a key way of revitalising knowledge and information. And for those of you who are aware, this was part of the, and Linda talked about it in her first session, this was part of what kind of gave genesis to the 5 children's books that Linda has done around particularly difficult conversations, such as family violence, for example. So pūrākau gives us these opportunities to bring back a whole range of knowledge, understandings, and sharing stories is important. Sharing those pūrākau is important. I would add that sharing those pūrākau in ways that do not, that actually speak back to some of the colonial ways in which they've told our stories. So we can't take for granted that the ways in which our stories have been told are actually legitimately the way that we want to tell them. We have to always be aware of who recorded the stories, of what their approach was to recording the stories, because if we go into stories that were gathered and recorded by early colonial ethnographers, we know that on the whole they are misogynist. The gender stuff within them is very detrimental, not only to Māori women, but to all Māori people. And so we have to engage with these stories in the telling of them in ways that actually are whakaaro Māori. That are coming through a whakaaro Māori rather than through a colonial lens. A number of pūrākau have always come up in these kōrero around, not just around family violence, not just around state violence, but around, even around well-being. We have many stories that actually tell us about well-being, and in essence, where they are utilised, so this te ohaki or hene is one that Ngā Kaitiaki Māori have utilised very powerfully. The stories of Niwareka and Mataora, the stories of hene nui te pō. We can't go into depth in these stories right now, or these pūrākau right now, but they are actually all stories of how we resolve and how we deal with conflict, but they're also stories about how we ensure and regenerate well-being. So the story of Niwareka is really a story of a return to whānau, a return to collective spaces where well-being could be restored. And that was a benefit for all Māori. So when we're thinking about pūrākau and we're thinking about how they are important, you know, one of the roles that we have is to practice storytelling. In my experience with other Indigenous communities, particularly Native American communities, is that storytelling is often still very alive. It's very daily and it happens intergenerationally all the time. I think here in Aotearoa we've been pushed with this notion of colonial storytelling taking over our stories, other people telling our stories, and us not having ownership of our own. And stories and pūrākau don't only have to be about mai rānō. Pūrākau can be your story to your child, to your mokopuna, to your whanaunga, around a process of healing through whakaaro Māori that happened yesterday. But I think it is about the practice of getting back into storytelling. Atua and our relationships to the roles of atua, the ways in which they can provide insights into behaviours, into interactions, into our Māori is something that's become very prevalent in a lot of healing work now, more so now. And you know, we do want to acknowledge the work being done around the atua Māori space and the way in which organisations are really elevating our understanding of atua. Our pūrākau and the essences of atua that we have provide us with understandings of behaviours, understandings of values, understandings of resolution, in this context, I'm talking about of karakia, of waiata, of whakanoa, how we relate, what the reciprocal relationships are we have, what the obligations we have, and that when we walk into any spaces, there is always a wairua essence or an atua essence that comes with us. So all of the kai kōrero said that and drew on a vast collection of knowledge around atua. Some is talking about sharing atua as a way of thinking about behavioural change. Some talking about atua as ensuring that we remember the relationships that we have to our taiao, to our whenua, that we understand that an abuse of papa tuanuku is an abuse of all Māori. Ia hai, e hare e te atua anake, he tupuna. Okay, so the role of, and the place of papa tuanuku, both as atua and as tupuna, and as a source of human well-being as well as our origins, means that the constant mamai of our whenua and of papa and of rangi and of all of the atua in between is a source of trauma for all. So we have a collective responsibility to draw on our essence to ensure that we tiaki those relations, but also to remember that they bring us inspiration and they bring us knowledge and wisdom that we can recognize every day. Whakatauki, whakatauaki, whakawai. We ask specifically for people to share any that they utilise in their mahi, that they utilise in their healing. We see here a number of definitions around whakatauki. I'll use whakatauki for now, but whakatauki, the difference between whakatauki and whakatauaki for those who are not sure. With whakatauki, you tend to not know the origin, the iwi origin or the person origin of the saying, or the context of it. Whakatauaki, the aki indicates that we know the origins. And we can locate the origins to a particular person or a particular hapu or a particular iwi. Wakawai is the term that we utilise here in Taranaki for whakatauki and whakatauaki. So you know, already just in the words that describe these, we know that there are a whole range of ways and multiple ways of thinking about this. And you know, Hene Moa Elder in her books around whakatauki talks about them as nuggets of wisdom. And that's always how we've seen whakatauki, that they have provided life guidance, information, sometimes he kōrero whakatūpato, you know, a note of caution, and sometimes a place of comfort for understanding what is happening. So kai kōrero throughout raised a range of whakatauki. He Waka Eke Noa, as we discussed at the beginning, is the one that we've chosen to utilise for this particular project. I'm just going to give a couple of examples. There are a whole range of them in the report. Ka mua ka muvi, looking to our past to move forward. So drawing on our ancestral knowledge, drawing on our ways of being, drawing on our history in order to create ways of moving or transforming forward. He mokopuna, he tupuna, he tupuna, he mokopuna. This is something that is said very often here in Taranaki, and other people would say, you know, for tūtama wahi that was sourced often in Uncle Tiki's kōrero, he mokopuna, he tupuna, he tupuna, he mokopuna. So that aligns to that we are always, we are both tupuna and mokopuna simultaneously. So we have a role to be able to be cognizant of our relationships, both as mokopuna and tupuna. He tangata he atua is something that a number of people spoke to. This often resonates for me with kōrero from Rangi Māori Rose Piri and what she would say all the time. He tangata he atua, he atua, he tangata. Similarly to the previous one, it's about the multiple roles that we carry. Waiata and more tiatia. You can't work with Hinewirangi and not have waiata and more tiatia coming up in your spaces all of the time. And so this is directly from her kōrero, but also from her master's thesis. And she reminded us all of the time about the voice that we have to share both our pain and to share our healing, and to finding our own songs to release pain. So waiata and mōtiatia was talked about by kai kōrero throughout the entire process of this mahi. Thinking about learning pāo, thinking about learning mōtiatia, thinking about the understanding it comes, the reference points it gives, how it gives us explanations of pain, how it also gives us explanations of resolution, how it reminds us of our place in the world. Our waiata and mōtiatia are sources of knowledge about ourselves, and they also provide a way for us to document our history and to document and release, as Hiniwirangi would say, to release grief, to release pain, to find our voice. Kapahaka, so there are a number of forms of waiata forms that were talked about, mātauranga forms. Kapahaka is one, and I do want to acknowledge the recent kapahaka for our kura tuatahi, tamariki, and the way in which, these, with all of the difficulties that can be to fund, to get to these things for our kura, it provides a space for our tamariki and our mokopuna and our rangatahi, our taioni, to engage with their own mōtiatia, to come to understand the knowledge that's deeply embedded in that. This particular quote leads up the kapahaka section for us, and it's from Kiri Tamihere Waititi. And it's, for those of you who haven't watched it, it comes from her kōrero in the M9 series, which is online if you search for it. And she speaks specifically to kapahaka as a healing form. And what's really critical is that, she highlights the ways in which kapahaka aligns to every healing practice that she's ever learnt in her training, and the ways in which things are engaged in kapahaka in a Māori way that provide us with what we need to understand and to heal. So it's a very powerful discussion around connection, around engaging with our knowledge and our transformation, and around release, and that this lives in kapahaka. So there are a number of quotes here about how kapahaka has enabled whanaungatanga, about how kapahaka has enabled access to te reo Māori, about how kapa enhances your sense of being on multiple levels, on a mātauranga Māori level, on a whanaungatanga level, on a whakapapa level, on a tinana level, a well-being level. So seeing the place of kapahaka, and this came up in some earlier research we did with Matatini, thinking about the role of kapahaka in supporting healing. Ori. Ori is a particular kind of mōtiatia, a particular kind of waiata, give us lines around whakapapa, historical narratives, and expected obligations and responsibilities. Again, I want to turn to some of the work that Hiniwirangi did during this mahi and previous mahi, where she actually wrote a book on how you write your own ori. And it was because people kept asking her, how do we write our own ori? So she produced a publication, which I believe is online, that was to support whānau to write their own ori. And ori provides us with a whole range of cultural transmission knowledges and messages. Mōtiatia and ori should not be left in the past. They must be brought through into the future. Wayne Ngata discussed this a number of years ago in a documentary we did around Tiakina Te Pāharakeke, Te Taonga Tuku Ngākau, around tamariki, that we need to bring ori back. And more recently, I've seen that Panaoni Gōwin has developed an ori with Orokawa, and particularly with Te Whare Puhunga. And he's done a publication of ori to share with the Iwi. because we need to bring these knowledge transmission processes back into our everyday lives. One area that we talked to everyone around within this mahi was maramataka. Now, we very deliberately asked about maramataka because we realized that in the regeneration of maramataka knowledge and the revitalization of maramataka knowledge, that we had never asked anyone about it specifically as a healing tool. And so we asked, we put to everyone we could, do you think maramataka has a role? Do you think there's a place for maramataka in understanding well-being? Do you think there's a place for maramataka in the healing of trauma and the healing of our experience of violence, both individual and collective violence? And it was a unanimous yes, as we would expect, because as we become more conversant with what maramataka means, and as we become more knowledgeable around what maramataka means and how the lunar calendar, as followed by our tupuna, can support us in understanding behaviours and moods and ways of being, we see this as a particular tool. Now, we know this is not new knowledge. This is revitalised and brought back in to our daily lives through, I guess, first and foremost, in many ways, through the recognition of matariki. And I'm not saying through having a national day, because even Vangi would say it's actually through the ceremony of matariki, because many people were in their own way acknowledging, affirming and uplifting that period of our calendar year for many years. But there has been something that has happened with that additional push to a national affirmation and acknowledgement of matariki and of the Māori New Year. So, we have much to acknowledge for those who did that push and those who are working really solidly in the matariki space. People like Langi, people like Hine Hotirimi, people who have done it in the past and passed on, like Wiremu Tāwhai. In the current time, Liliata Makiha, Shay Wilson, a whole range of people, Liliana Clark, Pauline Harris. And it is important to acknowledge that there was a final push needed for this knowledge to become really embedded in a national psyche. But more importantly, in this work, it's to begin to look at what this means for healing and how do we ensure that our whānau have access to this knowledge to live in their everyday lives. Because there's both the environmental, the material, the physical elements that are related to maramataka, but there's also the emotional and wairua connections that are related to maramataka. And it was a very, there was a lot of material in the report from people talking about maramataka, talking about the significance of maramataka, talking about how they utilize maramataka in their daily lives. Because it's not just about, as this person says, it's not just about phases of the moon or of the whetū. It's about everything that comes with the energies that come in our taiao, the energies that come in our relationships, the energies that come and impact on our lives. So there's a whole range of ways in which people talked about it, and we've kind of tried to bring these into some general areas. So one of them is, the marama phases. So, and there's a number of ways in which people talk about how marama phases impact both negatively and positively on them, but definitely in their consciousness. People were becoming more aware, having a greater awareness and a greater consciousness of what the day was, what the moon was, what was happening around them, what the context was, and what kind of things, they needed to do or not do in their own lives. And things like the full moon, whirl, they came up, but other parts of the maramataka and conversation also came up. And this is one specifically to thinking about whirl the impact of whiro when the moon is at its fullness, the things that they do or they don't do, the things that they avoid in that particular time. And so, yeah, I've heard many people say, you can't do this on a full moon, or you can't do this on a particular moon. Actually, what this knowledge is giving us a consciousness around what we're doing, giving us an awareness around what we're doing. So there are good days, or not so good days to do some things. Sometimes it doesn't mean that you don't do it, but you do it with a consciousness that it's not your ideal day to do it. And therefore you may put other things in place to ensure that people's well-being is maintained in that context. And I know that increasingly as an organisation here, and there are a number of organisations that spoke about marama phases and different moons and how they impact, or how they see an impact happening. And I know now that when we suggest a particular event here at Tutunga Wahine, that people go to the maramataka just to check in the day, just to make sure that we're conscious of the day that is, the moon that is, and what that may bring with it, and whether we should have that event or not have that event on that particular day. So people are utilising maramataka in many, many ways to uplift things, to have a consciousness of things, to minimise certain things, to do rituals in particular ways. So marama phases was really important. The other thing that came through a lot was the impact on moods. The impact on moods, which is really an impact on emotions as well, an impact on kariaroto, an impact on tuakiritanga, our identity, and the way in which our emotions raise things within all parts of us. There's sites of tuakiri, really. But one of them was around mood, around really thinking carefully around how certain things can polarize our moods, how certain times can bring a low energy, how certain things can bring a high energy. But one of the things too to think about is that when we are discussing high energy moons or high energy times of the maramataka, to also take care. Because when we're in high energy, we feel like we can do anything. And so we can actually, run ourselves really ragged in that time period. And we can actually exhaust ourselves in that time period. So because it's considered to be a high energy time, doesn't mean we have to rush out and do all of these additional things in that time. Okay? So we need to be cognizant both of what is happening in a low energy phase and what's happening in a high energy phase. This is what people were telling us throughout the kōrero. Making choices in line with maramataka, being aware that there are certain times where there are certain energies that are more likely to promote a form of chaos, or to promote a context of not really being as connected with yourself as you need to be. So these are not new to our people, but in the context of thinking about them as healing, I think that we really are over the past few years have really begun to think about maramataka. This is around whanaunga, which is around behaviours. So there's both moods, and then we know there are behaviours. And so being very careful, and this person talks about, on a low energy day, I can see that I'm waning. I can see that something's waning. So, my behaviour should align to that. It says if you're feeling stressed in a low energy time, you feel more vulnerable in a low energy time. If you are conscious of that, you can then be more determining of your behaviours. And this is something that, many of us are trying to work through in our lives. What is going on? Things that happen and you don't really know why they happened. I know often we'll get a message then that says, oh, it's this moon. You go, that's why. I mean, it's not putting all the responsibility in the lunar phases, for sure. It's about putting responsibility in how we have our roles and our obligations and our relationships to particular things. So I think it's a really important conversation. that has come up in this mahi that we haven't had in other similar mahi before. It doesn't mean that it's not present, and it certainly does not mean that Kaupapa Māori organisations are not already doing it. All it means is that we haven't had this conversation and this particular kind of rangahau around violence prevention before. Under Maramataka, Marakai. Marakai came up. Now, Marakai, we know, has multiple layers of influence and of benefit. And I am cognizant of this idea of telling everyone to run out and get a garden, and that's going to cure all. Well, we know that's not the case. What we need in the re-instigation of Marakai are all the knowledges that come with it. It's just not only about the kai. It's about the relationships to the Mara. It's about the relationships to each other in the Mara. And there's work being done progressively around the country. Kaupapa Māori organisations are supporting whānau back into Mara, are supporting whānau back into the relationships with the whenua. And it is about our reinstating and reconnecting our relationships to the whenua when we're engaged in Mara. The other thing that I did want to comment on around ideas around Marakai and access to kai off the whenua or off the moana is that as our whenua was removed from us, as our moana has been increasingly polluted, as our moana has been ravaged by commercial fishing and other ways of kai moana being stripped, reefs being stripped, and pollution, as all of that has happened, the connection to those things has not only been a disconnection, our wairua, and in terms of our relationship to those places that have been important to our tupuna, but it also has a major impact on our ability to assert our rangatiratanga around feeding our whānau. That we're in a time where neoliberal economics govern the buying of food, the expense of food, the cost of living, and so we don't have the same access to kai. So when I was growing up here in Waitara, my experience of food was we often got it from the whenua. We had a big garden, but not only that, people shared kai. People who went fishing down at the mouth of the Waitara River would come up in their trucks and they would distribute fish to people who need it. And the day before yesterday, a Māori man in Waitara who'd been whitebaiting delivered whitebait to my mother, who's 92. I haven't heard of that for a very long time. And she said, oh, he was giving it to all the old people, which for me, you know, is a return to a fundamental essence of how we are around kai. But if we're totally reliant on buying kai at the supermarket and the cost of living in an economic frame, then, you know, that reduces our ability to feed ourselves. And so the notion of poverty is quite a different notion now to what it may have been when you could still feed yourself. And I think that's something for us to be cognizant of, because people talked about Marakai. They talked about the connection, hononga ki te whenua, the connection to our whenua. That when we have that, and it comes through multiple ways of thinking about healing and thinking about connection to whenua, then a part of our practices now and our roles is to support that reconnection. Now, we say this in the knowledge of the fact that we are often living outside of our iwi rohi, or our hapu rohi, often for reasons beyond our control, and because of an intergenerational shift, often a forced shift for employment, but that we're often not connected specifically to our own tupuna, whenua taurikura, that whenua that we treasure because of our direct connection to it. And so being cognizant of that, and I know particularly Māori providers and healers working in urban contexts are cognizant of this. that our connection to whenua has to be done in multiple ways. In multiple ways. The other thing is that often the disposition of our whenua through colonisation, through mururo patu, has meant that many whānau don't have direct whenua that they can now walk on because it's occupied by others. It's been owned by others. And so thinking around what does that mean for us continues to be, if we're putting whenua connection up front in our work, continues to be something that we have to be cognizant of and that we have to help facilitate those connections. One of the ways I've seen a number of people doing that is through processes of hikoi, of taking groups of our people, whether they be our whānau, hapu and iwi, and walking the land, and reintroducing ourselves to walking our land, reintroducing ourselves to being on the land. Because it's not, I don't want to get caught up in this idea that we're making some kind of, making this a simple way of being, because often it's not, but that doesn't mean it's not able to be done. Papakainga has come up and it continues to come up consistently in the healing and well-being spaces and hauora spaces. And I really want to acknowledge those whānau, those hapu, those iwi, those individuals who are really working on making papakainga more accessible as a way of living for our people. So when we think about papakainga in the context of the current housing issues that we have, right, and the need to provide opportunities for whānau living, papakainga is one of those opportunities. And we do really say to anyone from iwi organisations, particularly post-settlement governance entities who are generally ordinanga that have the control over the resources in this context, that we need to really be thinking about papakainga if you're not already. And I know there are many iwi doing that, so please don't think that we don't know that, because we do. But what whānau was saying is that really, we see that there's a very practical way of healing, and that is about living in close proximity. It's about living in ways that we are collectively responsible and obligated to each other. What this also means, and Linda's going to talk about decolonisation later, but we actually have to decolonise our view that we should live as nuclear families in our little nuclear houses, domesticated houses. And we brought up nuclear family and the context of nuclear family and the imposition of the nuclear family on Indigenous peoples, and the ways in which that constructs sites where violence is more potentially able to occur, because it does. How do we, in a meaningful way, return to something like collective responsibility in our lives? And there are a number of whānau, including Hirirangi's whānau, that actually enact papakainga in a daily way. And it's not necessarily easy, but it is a way that people talked about healing and creating sites of prevention of violence. Rongoa. Again, this was not a surprise at all that rongoa is considered to be a critical and have a critical role in healing of violence, healing of all forms of violence, and all forms of mamai that come with the experiences of violence. And that's on a waiwa level, it's on a tinana level, it's on an individual level, it's on a collective level. So in many ways, I've been fortunate to listen to Rangi Mātāmua in other mahi talking about matariki and the power of matariki in that way that the ceremony brings, the power of what the ceremony brings, and the power of what the ability to call the names of those who have passed in the past year, to bring remembrance to them, to ritangi for them, and to know that when they board that waka to go, that they are well, and that they are cared for, and that we can show our aroha for them, and that we can call to them we can say their names, we can tangi for them, and we can release them. That is rongoa. So when I hear him talking and others talking about the power of ceremony, to be able to tangi in our processes of tangi is rongoa. Our tupuna gifted us a way, a tikanga and a kawa of being to grieve. It doesn't mean that the pain entirely goes away in that period. What it means is it gives us a process to work from hene nui te pō in the back of the whare to te ao marama in the front of the whare. And it's something that Takirirangi Smith talked about in the historical trauma work. That is rongoa. That is our ability to move through the phases of pō into the phases of marama, into te ao marama, in order to be again with the living, in order to live our lives. Because our tupuna want us to live our lives. So there is rongoa, there is ritual, there is rongoa, as this person wrote, that was about tohunga. They're speaking specifically to their mahi with fire rose pere, around oranga, around wairako, rongoa in terms of wairako, rongoa in terms of karakia, rongoa in terms of kai. These are all rongoa. And we really acknowledge that working with the people that we've been fortunate to work with as researchers, like Ngāropi, like Heniwirangi, like Te Puna Oranga, that all of the team at Tūtamawahine, that in that space is about rongoa. It's about the social, the political, the cultural, the physical, the emotional, the psychological well-being of whānau. And that rongoa is at our fingertips. And we need to grasp it, but we also need to share it. We also need to share it. Whakapakari tinana, again, is a part of rongoa. And the kapahaka kōrero that Kiri Tamahere Waititi provided in M9 was one example where she talked about the multiple benefits of kapahaka on its multiple layers, on an emotional layer, on a psychological layer, on a material layer, on a tinana layer. And so this particular theme we had seen coming through, and we thought, oh, that's kapaka, oh, that's whānau, oh, that's manaki, until we presented the work, some of the work. And it was a Māori man in the audience, Nepia Mahawika, and he said to us, all of that's whakapakari tinana. Have you talked about whakapakari tinana? And of course, this kind of feedback is what the feedback we went and, kapaka te kapa. That actually all of these things are in all those other areas. They are kapaka, they are wairua, but they're also whakapakari tinana. So what do we do in terms of releasing a physicality and a physical energy? And so we re-looked at them and we started seeing that all the way through people were talking about tinana, hākina kina, kapaka. And we were putting them into, so we took that out and put it in a particular theme around whakapakari tinana. Then we began to see that some of the people talking about maramataka were also talking about performance. They were also talking about movement. They were also talking about when you work marakā, you're working your body. So it was another area that we've often overlooked as being a part of something else, but we really wanted to pull out as a theme for us to all consider. Karakia, again, in terms of rongoa, and there are very in-depth discussions around karakia, around the place of karakia into bringing spaces, places, people, environments into a sense of balance, into a sense of clearing, into a sense of well-being, that these are processes of restoration and that they are processes of opening and closing, and that we have roles of people within our whānau hapu and iwi that can do this and that do this, but also we can do it for ourselves. And this is I think something that's very much in the very first quote, that it's about your intent. It's about enabling us to actually do it for ourselves. That there are karakia, there are clearing that we can do for ourselves and bring that into our whānau hapu and iwi. And that karakia gives us with a whole range of ways of bringing spaces and places and people back into balance when we are out of balance, whatever the source of that our balance or our being out of balance might be. And so karakia as a site of recovery, as a site of redevelopment, as sites of healing, and that, often when we're working or have experienced a whole range of organizational violence, institutional racism, we need to clear that ourselves. And so it is important that we think about how we can do that, how we can bring that about in a daily way, as well as have access to those tohunga that hold those other notions, and to matakiti, that hold the other deeper meaning and deeper context of karakia. And this brings us to the final kōrero that I want to share today. There's a lot more in depth in the actual report itself, and it's hōhau te rongo. It's about how we bring about rongo into our lives, how we bring about calm and resolution and instilling that in our lives, in our ways of being, and practicing those forms of resolution and recognizing rongo as a deity of calm, as a deity of peace, of revitalizing that knowledge and the practices that come with that, revitalizing the knowledge. And we are talking very generally in the report around these kaupapa. It does come down to each of the whānau hapu iwi that you're within, organizations, kaupapa Māori organizations that you're within, to see what that means within your context, within your whenua, within your rohi, within your hapu, within your iwi. Taranaki has a long history of hōhau rongo that has been continued to be practiced by many. But really, in terms of whānau having that knowledge and space, that is something that we need to do more of. One of the things that came up in the Hioranga Ngākau was this particular kaupapa. How do we embed knowledge and practices back into our own whānau, so that there is someone we go to, that there is someone we can find support from? And what you'll see when Shirley does next week, the survey information, she'll come to a slide where she talks about where do you go to for support. Pretty much the top 5 are relative to Kaupapa Māori. The top 2 are whānau and friends. And friends and kaupapa whānau. So what does that say to us? It tells us that in order to ensure well-being, we have to ensure Whānau Ora. And I'm not talking about the policy or the program, even though there's a powerful way of being in those. I'm talking about how do we embed this into every whānau. So when something happens, whānau can deal in the first phase with whatever the kaupapa is or the taki is, because they have someone that can support how to do that. And this is a really big ask for all of us, because many of us haven't had access to this knowledge. And so we did think, who are the people around the motu now that are practitioners of hōhau te rongo in whatever context? Who are those practitioners? And how may we think about this collectively as a way of bringing that knowledge together to then share at a whānau level, and then at a hapu level, at a pa level, a papakainga level, an iwi level, a national level. So no reira e te iwi, nei taku kōrero mo tēnei wā, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Leonie, he rongoa ki roto i te oro o tō reo, ngā kupu i kōrero hia e koe, me era kōrero katoa, ia momo kōrero. He pātai tō tītii i roto i te hapori nei. Ngā mihi e hine, he pātai. Kei te aha te wānanga a tohu raua ko te whiti. Ka ti, he ona whakāturanga ki a tātou mō te anaia nei. Ki taku nei whakaro, he rongoa ki roto i era kōrero a tohu raua ko te whiti mō tātou ngā uri.
Ai, tēnā koe, tēnā tātou, mō tērā kōrero me tērā pātai nei. Ai, kei roto i ngā kōrero te whiti rao ko tohu, kei roto i ngā whakaro mo te huhu rongo, ngā whakaro mo rongo, me te āhuatanga o parihaka, me te raukura, ara ngā rongoa, ara tētahi momo, tētahi momo whakāhua, kia whakatika, kia whakaora, kia whakarauora tangata. No reira, me ko atu tēnei ki tērā pātai. In many ways, I guess everything that we're saying is kind of embedded in that whakaro, that within our whānau hapu iwi, within our taranaki, for us within our taranakitanga, within our parihakatanga, within our raukuratanga, all of those āhua are processes, are tikanga, are kawa through which we can draw, from which we can draw to seek healing, to develop new healing, wera āhuatanga katoa. And, and in doing that, bring back to ourselves our own healing processes. And doing that within the current context that we now find ourselves. And it's a context that's probably going to get more violent in an economic context for our people, which will bring a whole range of other things. So how do we come back into those fundamental essences of what our tupuna have given? I think that's really the knuckle of what has come out from this kōrero's not from me, it's not even from the team. This kōrero is from all those people who generously gifted their whakaro to us to share, because they wanted to share this whakaro. So, yeah.
Leonie, ko titi wahanga o tērā pātai, is kei hea ngā wānanga mō era kōrero. Where do we gather together? Where do we waka witi o karo? Mō ēnei kōrero tupuna, hio te anō ēnei kōrero mokopuna.
Well, we have to do it. I mean, we have to do it for ourselves because no one else is going to do it for us. And that means, and it is around, and many, there's many people that are just on this kōrero that do it. And so my thing is, how do we enhance it? How do we expand it? How do we make it more available to us? And so it's trying to find all of those in places, within events, within contexts that we're all doing, within developing resources, within making things available. But at the end of the day, what we know is that, and I'm going back to Linda's initial point around whakapapa, kōrero, around whanaungatanga, around manaakitanga, those kind of concepts that it's an intergenerational transmission we need to be doing. Pūrākau. Jenny Lee Morgan says all of the time, I hear her saying all the time, just tell the story. Tell the story and let our tamariki and mokopuna come to an understanding through the pūrākau in the way that our tupuna did for us, because we don't have a directive culture. we're stuck in this kind of neoliberal Western ideological way of thinking that tells us we have to tell our children what to do. We have to be directive to tamariki and mokopuna. We have to say things like, I feel this, and when you do this, this was happened to me. Well, actually, we need to be telling stories to our. I mean, I do want to say, I've been really fortunate to have been a part of with Te Ata Rāwea, a taranaki reo, maunga reo, over the past 10 weeks, led out by Ruakiri Honda and his whānau, kaimahi, mainly through Tātarangi, and it's been pūrākau based. And what it's done is just really affirmed again to me the power of pūrākau and the power of the messages of pūrākau. And I've said this before, but when my tamariki were little, when I was first really thinking, because I'm not really a storyteller, and I have to practice a story before I can tell a story. Other people I know can just tell a story, and I'm fixated by them when they tell it. And so I remember thinking, we were fishing in Whānau Ora and on the wharf, and my two youngest kept going right to the edge, and I was in this, thing, are they going to fall in? They're going to fall in. And I was saying, I said to them a number of times, you can't go all in Māori, you can't go to the edge, you're going to fall, you might fall. And then, it just didn't work. And I thought, okay, I need to do this differently. So I started talking to them about whether they thought a taniwha might be under the wharf. Now, that's not a pūrākau of that area. I just asked them, kia whakaaro, he tani whakiraro? Well, their whole āhua changed. And they did not go near the edge, even though we weren't sure. So, there's something in what our tupuna, and I remember Rose Petty, when we read Rose Petty's work, and I'm not trying to go on about those, those whakaaro from those particular writers and people, but, there's so much power in some of the early writing that our people did for us. And it was learning by observation, learning through pūrākau, understanding the narrative, understanding the roles and obligations that come in the narrative. I think that is the power of Linda as a scholar making this decision partway through these projects to sit and write stories, pūrākau, tamariki stories, around what she and we understand to be difficult conversations. They never used to be difficult conversations. These never used to be difficult conversations. That's our context of colonization. They used to be conversations that we had all the time. So how do we move out of this kind of colonial anxiety that we have about having these conversations, which I think it is, into rethinking this? And personally, I grapple with this every day, and I'm sure many people do. How do we come about having these conversations? What are the pūrākau? So inside of that, in 10 weeks, I think I learned more about our tupuna whakaaro around those particular pūrākau and what I need to embed in my life than I have in a very long time.
And to have, someone like you saying that you're on a continual learning journey as well, when you give so much to many, he mihi tēnei ki a koe, nā siena, tēnā koe e te wahine tūmaia, kua tau te mauri I te rongo, manoa nei I ngā kōrero a koe mā a koroma, e tau awhia nei te ara whakamua. So what I'm hearing from Siena is the ara whakamua that this rongoa enables us to propel or to release. And you use the word release a number of times in your presentation, Leonie, releasing physicality, releasing Māori, and you so this idea of release, some people might see it as a something that you're giving away or you're letting go. What does release mean for you?
Well, it's not letting go in the Pākehā sense of telling someone to let something go. It's not that. It's he momo tikanga, i roto te ao Māori, i rongo, i maumahara ai te wā, i hara mai a huiranga I konei ki tutama wahine ma tana kōrero, and hā, te rame mo te hā, mo te hau. So I think that within our, actually I don't think, I know that within our tikanga, there are ways of releasing particularly emotions or sometimes reactions to things, that we have to find ways of releasing them that are more healthy. And so things like breath, but also movement, moving ourselves, hikoi. That's why I think in the notion of mara kai, that it's not just about food, and it's about many things. And I've heard that before. I've heard, Glenn Skipper talk about this in terms of tāwhirikura and the mara kai that they did. In fact, I remember him saying it's less about food than it is about everything else that comes with the whanaungatanga, with the hononga ki te taiao, ki te whenua. It's more about that. And food is a kind of beneficial outcome. But I also remember in the work with Mahinekura many years ago around matarako and rongoa and healing, that there was a section there around kai, and everyone who spoke to that kōrero talked in the same vein, that there were many things about kai, many things about the planting of kai, the harvesting of kai, whether you're harvesting in the moana or harvesting in the awa or harvesting in the land, that the process of doing that was a physical process. Now,
and a reconnection process.
Yes, and so we are releasing energy, we are being physical. And so if we don't do that, if our only way of getting kai is going to a supermarket, we're missing out on a whole range of other things that come for our psychological, emotional, spiritual well-being, alongside our physical well-being, that we don't get by doing that. And I think that probably in a context that we're in now of an economic, of more increased economic disparities, increased economic denial to many of our whānau, we need to come to the fore. And I do want to say that iwi organisations, PSGEs, iwi organisations, runanga, have a role now in doing that. And it's not about selling our people food. It's about supporting the cultivation of kai with those people around the motu that are doing mara already, and supporting them to do that because of all of the many benefits that come with that.
So you say they have a role. What is their role? What can they do?
Well, I think that there's an important role in the facilitation of wānanga like the maunga reo that we've just been a part of. Supporting hui, supporting wānanga, supporting access to mātauranga Māori, supporting access to affordable food, supporting access to affordable homes. I'm not saying that it's only for iwi, because the Crown has taken this stuff away and the Crown needs to return it. In the same way that we've said for many years, riro whenua atu, me hoki whenua mai. But in the taking of the whenua, they've taken many things that they have to return. They've taken an economic base that they have to return. Our first experience of homelessness, which is shown in the work through Pūrangakura and others that are looking at papakainga and housing issues for Māori, our first experience of homelessness came through our first experience of landlessness. The removal of us from our whenua is the origins of Māori homelessness now, or houselessness now. And so that puts a huge roll back to the Crown. I mean, many of our iwi, some have, but many didn't, in their settlements, look at things like even the funding of Te Reo Māori, even the way in which we need to resource mātauranga, the way in which we need to resource our own educational systems. So I think the role of iwi on one level is to do all that can be done, and research shows that our people want the knowledge, they want the mātauranga, and as I said, a number of iwi are doing this and doing it really well. And so we don't want to dismiss that at all. We want to acknowledge and affirm that, but also to keep the wero to the crown around everything else that is happening.
You also mentioned that we need to challenge the notion of singular unitary living, the nuclear family and home, and I do see investment from runanga and PSGEs in housing, but I'm interested in that comment as well that you've shared. How might their utilisation or their ability to address some of those take also bring that shared connection that papakainga can have. You talked a lot about maramataka not just being about when to plant or phases, but also the energy of it. And you also mentioned that we can draw on ceremonies like matariki. How do those ceremonies support healing?
I think what happens is that they enable us to express our cultural ways of being in those frames. So matariki in particular, because of the way in which we understand it to be a time of the moving of those who are passed in the past lunar calendar, supporting them to take their final journey, is and acknowledging the mamai and acknowledging them in our relationships, and being able to tangi, but also being able to hakari for the newness that's coming, and to recognize the newness of what is happening in the next phase. So all of those things are something that, very Māori. Very Māori. And so what we've seen is that in the last couple of years, this regeneration of it on a national level and a recognition of it on a national level. But as I said, many people have been doing it for periods of time, and there's a lot of reflections from different people that I've heard just around the lohi, reflecting on then their grandparents did something, or reflecting on, and they may not have called it that, reflecting on puanga ceremonies that happened, and so there's a source in that. But we also know that the maramatanga is full of many sites and many phases of celebration, of transition, of change, and so we have focused on this one period, and so I think that now enables us to move into thinking about other periods. So we know that matariki aligns, in a general Western thing around the winter, the kind of winter solstice time, but there's also a summer solstice time. So what are our tupuna do in that period? So I think it's opened us this way of thinking and way of being that can now start us thinking about other ways of being. I've also, the maramataka and the work of people like Ngāhui and Murphy and others in relation to ikura, in relation to menstruation cycles and the relationship to the lunar calendar, the relationship to rona, and the marama, that's brought, and that's been building for some period of time as well, brought us back into a whole phase of challenging some fundamental gender belief systems that people like Alston Best and Beres Hua embedded in our psyche, to the point where we started calling ikura a mate. Well, it's not a mate. Woman's cycle is not a mate. We're not dying, nor are we sick. It's tapu. It's a time of tapu. And I do remember the first time I heard a phrase around veringa atua, which I heard from someone who had been talking to huirangi. And I remember thinking that and thinking, that just fits. And that was many years ago. My children were small, so probably 30 odd years ago when I first heard that term. Atua.
He rongo, ki roto I era o ngā kōrero katoa. E te rangatira, e te marae kura, tēnei te mihi ki a koe. Ko pau te waki a tāua I tēnei wā. Engari, Ma te kapo i ngā kōrero e taina te tangata, te kimi e nei rongoa haere ake nei. Thank you for your generosity and also the generosity of you and all of the presenters agreeing to having these kōrero recorded and accessible. And e te whānau, in the next couple of days, this kōrero will be accessible on the Tūtama Wahine website, as the last week's sessions are already loaded and available at the website. Leonie, thank you for leading this this rangahau, and we look forward to the release in December of the rangahau, and I hope that those who have registered for our webinars might be able to access that. Is that kei te tika tira, that they may be able to? Yep, I see a nod. That is fantastic. Whānau, I'd like to just acknowledge all of the rōpū who support our kai rangahau to bring this rongoa to us. We've had a lot of mihi come to Whai Leonie here on line today, and I hope you feel like I do, that there's just mauri tau going through my tinana and hine ngaro, ki te wakarongo ki ēnei rongo kei a tātou I roto i te kapu o te ringa. E mihi ana ki a koutou, te akina koutou I tēnei wā. Hiki tia ngā taumahatanga, hiki tia ngā taupēhitanga, kia wātea arai, kia tau te Māori, kia puta ki te whaiau, ki te ao mārama, tihei Māori ora. See you at our next session, I te whānau. Tēnā rā tātou.